I want you to take a second, just right now, and picture someone you've known for a really long time.
Like a childhood friend, maybe?
Yeah, exactly. Someone you grew up alongside, someone you feel like you have completely mapped out in your head, you know?
Right.
You know their habits, their quirks, their quiet moods. But then I want you to imagine this moment where you look at this person, this absolute fixture in your life, and you get this cold, sinking realization that you might not actually know the architecture of their mind at all.
It's, it fundamentally shakes your confidence in your own perception
Oh, totally.
because we build these mental models of the people around us. And when those models collapse, the familiar suddenly becomes entirely alien.
And that feeling of an alien landscape hidden in plain sight is exactly where we are starting today. If you've ever looked at someone in your life who is incredibly quiet, someone who moves at like a glacial pace, or someone who just sits around seemingly doing nothing.
And you've judged them for it.
Yeah. Right. If you've called them lazy or apathetic or disconnected, this deep dive into our source material today is going to completely rewire how you look at them. We're unpacking this fascinating set of notes and reflections centered around a man who lives in what the author calls a sensory world. This is a childhood friend of the author, deeply withdrawn and seemingly trapped.
Yeah, and we are going to examine the mechanics of extreme sensory processing, neurodivergence, and the complex family dynamics that shape a person's reality. And I think we should lay a conceptual foundation right now.
Okay, let's do it.
Throughout this discussion, I want us to think of the human brain not just as an organ, but as an operating system.
An operating system, like iOS or Windows.
Precisely. We all run on operating systems that dictate how we process inputs, manage background tasks, and interact with the physical hardware of the world. And society, well, it's built for a very specific standard issue operating system. It prioritizes speed, efficiency, rapid context switching. But what happens when someone is running a profoundly different OS? One that prioritizes high-fidelity sensory rendering over speed.
It's going to look like the machine is broken. I mean, even if it's actually doing something incredibly complex. And that brings us to the most visible symptom of this friend's behavior, which is his apparent total inaction. The source material paints this really vivid picture of him just sitting in front of the television all day, doing absolutely nothing from morning until night.
Yeah.
Society looks at this and slaps the label of a massive waste of time on it. We look at someone stationary and tell them to, get up and engage with the world.
Because we equate physical movement with value.
Yeah.
If you are producing, talking, or moving, your OS is functioning properly in the eyes of society. But for someone with extreme sensory sensitivity, this prolonged stillness is not a failure to act. It is a highly active, critical survival mechanism.
I really want to break down the mechanics of that survival mechanism because from the outside, survival looks like foraging, working, dodging threats. It looks active. How is sitting in a chair doing nothing an active survival strategy?
To grasp this, we have to explore the processing cost of daily existence.
Okay.
Let's look at a standard neurotypical operating system. When you walk into a cafe, your brain encounters thousands of data points. The hum of the refrigerator, the fluorescent lights, the smell of roasted beans, the overlapping conversations, the physical sensation of the chair you sit on.
There's so much going on.
Right. But your brain has a built-in sensory gating mechanism. It's often managed by the thalamus, which essentially acts as a spam filter. It takes 99% of that data and just deletes it before it ever reaches your conscious awareness.
So I just experienced being in a cafe instead of being bombarded by 1,000 micro events?
Yes.
It takes very little conscious energy.
But for someone with profound sensory processing differences, that spam filter is remarkably thin.
Right.
Or sometimes it functions in a completely different way entirely. Every single piece of data might be hitting their conscious awareness at full volume. Making eye contact with a cashier isn't just a polite social gesture.
It's a massive cognitive download.
Exactly. It is a massive cognitive download.
Because they have to process the micro expressions, the eye dilation, the social expectations.
All simultaneously, while also trying to decipher the tone of the spoken language, while ignoring the scratchiness of their own shirt, while processing the hum of the refrigerator that sounds like a jet engine to them.
Oh, man.
The energy required just to exist in a standard environment is astronomically high. So sitting in front of the TV all day is a deliberate strategy to control variables.
So the TV isn't about entertainment.
Not at all.
The TV is a predictable input.
It minimizes the intake of unpredictable data so the brain can simply attempt to reach equilibrium. It's an energy conservation protocol.
That makes me think of our operating system analogy again. It's like a smartphone running 100 heavy-duty applications in the background, like GPS, 4K video rendering, intense 3D games.
Right.
You look at the phone sitting on the table, and the home screen is totally still. To an observer, the phone is doing nothing. But inside, the processor is maxed out, the device is physically overheating, and the battery is hemorrhaging power just to keep the screen on.
That is the exact architectural mismatch we are talking about.
Yeah.
The home screen looks blank, but the CPU is operating at 100% capacity. Society walks up, looks at the blank screen, and demands, why aren't you opening any new apps? Why aren't you being productive?
Yeah.
And the person's internal system is silently screaming, if I initiate one more process, the entire motherboard is going to fry.
That reframes everything, and the source material gives an incredibly intense example of this CPU overload. It describes how this friend takes an abnormally long time to eat a meal or takes several hours just to take a shower. And again, the societal judgment is terrible time management or sloppiness.
Yeah.
But if his OS is rendering every sensory input at 8K resolution, taking a shower isn't a simple 5-minute task.
Not at all. When he steps into the shower, he is experiencing an entirely different reality than someone running a standard OS. A neurotypical person conceptualizes a shower as a narrative bridge, like, I am getting clean so I can go to work.
Right.
The physical sensations are secondary to the goal.
But for him, the physical sensations are the entire event. The text mentions the microfluctuations in water temperature, the dense smell of the shampoo, the friction of the soap on his skin.
If your system is receiving data at that level of absolute density, the concept of chronological time dissolves.
Wow.
You lose that overarching narrative of getting to work. Your consciousness is entirely hijacked by the micro-reality of the sensation. Society dismisses this as a lack of diligence, but it's actually a state of total, inescapable sensory immersion. The brain is trying to process a relentless symphony of physical inputs. It cannot simply close the program and move to the next task until the current avalanche of data is categorized and managed.
He's living life under an electron microscope. Everything is magnified to 1,000 times its normal size, which means every task takes 1,000 times longer to process. But here is where the source material takes a fascinating turn. We've established that this extreme quietness and slowness is a heavy, necessary defense mechanism against this sensory avalanche.
Yes.
So what happens when that defense system is forcibly shut down?
We see an extraordinary behavioral shift.
The author describes what happens when this chronically silent, practically immobile friend drinks alcohol. It's a complete inversion. He goes from being entirely mute to laughing out loud.
Right.
He actively initiates social contact, asking the author to go to karaoke. And there's this one vivid detail when they get there. He leaves the karaoke room door wide open while he's singing.
Leaving the door open is the most telling action in that entire sequence.
Now, I have to play devil's advocate here. I read this, and my immediate thought was, isn't that just alcohol?
Right, liquid courage.
Yeah, we literally call it liquid courage for a reason. A quiet guy has a few beers, his inhibitions drop, and he gets loud. Standard college bar behavior. Why are we treating this as some profound insight into his specific neurodivergence?
It's a crucial distinction to make. Alcohol lowers inhibitions across the board, yes. But we have to examine what specific mechanisms are being inhibited.
Okay.
For a neurotypical person, the brakes being released might be the fear of telling a bad joke or the self-consciousness of dancing poorly. But for someone with profound sensory processing differences or chronic social anxiety, their baseline reality is a state of constant, exhausting neurological braking.
You mean their entire waking life is lived with the emergency brake pulled all the way up?
Exactly. They live with the accumulated trauma of knowing their natural reactions do not fit the societal operating system. They have learned through decades of negative feedback that if they show their true internal state, they will be misunderstood, corrected, or rejected.
Right, so they just hide it.
So their prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain responsible for executive function and behavioral suppression, is working overtime. When alcohol enters the bloodstream, it depresses the central nervous system, particularly that prefrontal cortex. It literally turns off the emergency brake.
So it's not that the alcohol is installing a new extroverted personality program. It's temporarily disabling safe mode.
The alcohol is unmasking the core system. Leaving that karaoke door wide open isn't a sudden drunken desire for an audience. It is the profound physical relief of finally stopping the exhausting, continuous effort of keeping the door closed.
Oh, wow.
The desire to laugh, to sing, to exist without a barrier between himself and the world, that was always his baseline. It was just trapped behind a massive firewall of necessary self-defense.
That is a staggering way to look at it. He's not gaining liquid courage. He is getting a chemical furlough from a prison he has to actively build around himself every single day. And the source goes even deeper into this unmasking, specifically focusing on how he communicates when this firewall comes down.
He begins to use the language of sensation.
Yes. The author notes that when he's drunk, he doesn't suddenly engage in abstract philosophical debates. He uses deeply specific, sensory-heavy language to describe his internal state. He describes his body as feeling buzzy. He tries to explain his emotions by comparing them to physical colors and textures. Instead of saying, "I'm happy," he maps the feeling to a specific physical sensation.
This brings up a foundational issue regarding how humans communicate. Standard language, the vocabulary we use in daily life, is a consensus tool. It was evolved and built for the masses to transmit generalized information efficiently. When I say I am sad, it's a shorthand.
Right.
Bucket term. You generally know what bucket I'm pointing to.
Right, it gets the point across quickly so we can keep moving. Efficiency.
But for someone operating on a high-fidelity sensory OS, a bucket term like happy or sad is hopelessly inadequate. It is far too low resolution.
Yeah.
If your internal experience involves a cascade of physical tingling in your extremities, a shift in perceived body temperature, a mental image of a highly specific shade of indigo, and a change in the physical texture of your thought patterns.
That's a lot of data.
It is. Forcing all of that data into the blunt word happy feels like a lie. It feels like a severe data loss.
It's like trying to describe a beautiful, complex orchestral symphony by just saying...
By just saying it was loud.
In fact, you lose the entire truth of the experience.
So when the alcohol removes his filter and he starts talking about his body being buzzy or feeling like colors, he isn't attempting to be poetic. He is being as strictly precise as his OS will allow.
Wow.
He is abandoning the low-resolution societal dictionary and asking his friend, "Do you understand this raw, unfiltered data? Can you meet me in the reality I actually inhabit, rather than the translated, watered-down version society forces me to use?"
Yeah. It's a moment of incredible vulnerability, but it also raises a massive question. If his internal world is that rich, that vivid, and that expansive, how did he learn to build such an impenetrable firewall in the first place?
That's the real question.
Where did the mandate to shut down completely come from? To understand the architecture of his defenses, the source material takes us into the environment he was raised in. We have to look at the family dynamics.
The family unit is the initial testing ground where an operating system learns how to interact with a network. In psychology, specifically family systems theory, we look at the home as an ecosystem seeking equilibrium, even if that equilibrium is highly dysfunctional.
And the ecosystem described in these notes is highly volatile. The author describes a profoundly aggressive, powerful mother who operates with an absolute lack of boundaries.
Yes.
There is a deeply uncomfortable detail where she publicly and casually discusses her own daughter's menstrual cycle in front of guests, and paired with this overpowering mother is a father who is completely silent, practically a ghost in his own home.
We have to analyze how a developing child processes this specific environment. It's not a simple matter of inheriting traits.
Right. A kid doesn't just download 50% of the mom's aggression and 50% of the dad's silence. It's more like a forced adaptation.
Yeah.
You mix these two volatile elements together, and the child's OS has to generate a brand new, highly specific behavioral algorithm just to survive the living room.
Let's break down the data the child is receiving. First, the mother's overwhelming presence and dominance. This teaches the child a fundamental law of physics for their world. Pushing back is futile. If you exert your own force, you will be crushed by a vastly superior force.
So rule number 1, do not engage in conflict.
But rule number 2 is far more damaging. The public broadcasting of intimate details, the total disregard for personal boundaries. This teaches the child, if I reveal my inner world, if I show vulnerability or personal data, it will not be protected. It will be seized and exploited.
That's terrifying.
The author of the text uses the brilliant metaphor here. It's like someone walking into the sanctuary of your mind with muddy shoes.
Muddy shoes in your mind. The violation of that is visceral.
If pushing back gets you crushed and sharing gets your mind trampled with muddy shoes, what is the most logical adaptation for the child's OS?
You disconnect the external ports. You shut down entirely.
You go blank. You slow your responses to a crawl. You give the invading force absolutely no surface area to grab onto, silence becomes a highly effective, impenetrable shield. And then the child looks to the other adult in the room for confirmation of this strategy.
The dad, the ghost.
The silent father is providing real-time, living proof of the child's new algorithm. The father's survival in the ecosystem demonstrates the only way to exist in this house without being destroyed is to be entirely invisible.
So the child's core programming is rewritten around radical invisibility. And the source material provides an example of this dynamic playing out decades later, and honestly, it's chilling. It's the eternal child dynamic. The author describes watching the mother interact with this friend when he's a full-grown adult in his 20s. They are standing at the front door, preparing to leave the house. And the mother is physically checking his shoelaces. She is checking his pockets for his wallet. She is verbally issuing him a strict curfew.
The operational detail that matters most here is the delivery mechanism. The author notes that she does all of this in a soft, sweet, babying tone.
That tone completely changes the context. I mean, if she were screaming at him to tie his shoes, it would look like aggressive domination. But doing it sweetly makes it look like extreme care.
In family systems theory, this is a textbook example of enmeshment and overfunctioning. The soft tone masks the absolute destruction of his autonomy. This behavior is not caretaking, it is systemic management.
Right.
By preemptively solving every minor hurdle for over 2 decades, she has structurally dismantled his ability to initiate action.
Let's explore that, because autonomy is something we take for granted. We think of it as a personality trait, like being stubborn or independent. But it's actually a learned skill, right?
Autonomy is a feedback loop. Think about a neurotypical developmental trajectory. You forget your wallet, you get to the store, you face the humiliation or inconvenience of not being able to pay, and your brain logs that negative feedback.
Exactly.
The next time, your OS initiates a wallet check protocol before leaving the house. You trip over untied shoelaces, you scrape your knee, you learn to tie them securely.
Trial, error, and consequence, the basic learning algorithm.
But if a parental firewall intercepts every potential error before it can even occur, the child's feedback loop is severed. The child learns a devastating overarching lesson. My own foresight, my own will, and my own actions are irrelevant.
Wow.
The environment will simply manage me. The part of the brain responsible for self-initiation, the internal motivation engine, is systematically starved of the data it needs to grow.
So when we look back at him taking hours in the shower or sitting immobile in front of the TV, it's not just sensory overload. It's also a symptom of an OS that has never been allowed to boot up its own executive function. The mother has been running his administrative controls for his entire life.
And we must analyze the mother's psychological architecture objectively, without simply labeling her a villain.
Right.
In highly enmeshed systems, an overfunctioning parent often subconsciously requires the child's dependence to maintain their own psychological equilibrium.
What does that mean? She needs him to be broken.
She needs him to need her. If her primary identity, her core purpose in the world, is defined by being the all-knowing, indispensable caretaker of a vulnerable child, what happens to her identity if that child becomes an independent adult?
She becomes obsolete. Her purpose vanishes.
Exactly. Her psychological stability relies on his inability to function. Her overmanagement, wrapped in that sweet, babying tone, acts as a velvet cage. It keeps him functionally small so that her role remains functionally massive.
And this dynamic collides with the modern world in a way that is utterly catastrophic. Which brings us to the smartphone catch-22. This is where psychological enmeshment weaponizes societal infrastructure.
This is a profound point of failure in his ecosystem.
The source notes that the mother flat out refused to buy her 20-something-year-old son a smartphone. And her reasoning was classic old-school parenting logic. Like, if you want a phone, you need to go out, work, earn your own money, and buy it yourself.
To a casual observer, that sounds like a standard mechanism for instilling a work ethic. It's a very common societal script.
It sounds like tough love. But for a neurodivergent adult who is already structurally isolated, who takes 3 hours to process the sensory input of a shower, demanding he get a job before he gets a phone is like telling someone they have to successfully swim a mile across the ocean before you'll let them have a life jacket.
Yes.
The logic is entirely inverted.
It reveals a severe misunderstanding of what a smartphone represents in contemporary society.
Yeah.
We still hold on to this vestigial idea that a smartphone is a luxury, a toy for social media and games. But for someone whose internal processing speed does not align with the relentless, standardized pace of the physical world, a smartphone is not a luxury. It is critical infrastructure. In cognitive science, we talk about cognitive offloading. A smartphone acts as a brain auxiliary device.
A brain auxiliary device. Tell me how that works for him practically.
If his internal OS struggles with sequential planning, time blindness, or geographical mapping, common traits in neurodivergence, the smartphone handles those heavy computational loads.
Okay.
It manages alarms, visual schedules, GPS routing, and written communication, which is vastly easier to process than the high-stakes, real-time demands of face-to-face verbal interaction.
So by denying him the phone, she is unplugging his external hard drive. And think about the job market. You cannot walk into a business today, shake the manager's hand, and hand over a paper resume.
The entire entry-level job infrastructure has moved online. You must navigate digital application portals. You need mapping software to determine complex public transit routes to an interview. If hired, you are required to use shift management apps to view your schedule and digital platforms like Slack or group messaging to communicate with management.
You are functionally invisible to the economy without a digital presence. By demanding he get a job to earn the phone, she is actively withholding the exact tool required to secure the job. It is an impossible loop. But the tragedy of the withheld smartphone goes so much deeper than just employment, doesn't it?
The most devastating consequence is the total enforcement of isolation.
Because the internet is where you find your people when your physical environment rejects you.
Without access to the digital world, this friend was severed from vital life-saving information. He could not privately research social welfare systems. He could not access vocational rehabilitation programs tailored for neurodivergent individuals.
Right.
And most importantly, he was cut off from discovering online communities of people who experience the world exactly the way he does.
He was denied the realization that his OS wasn't a unique, broken anomaly. He could have found forums, message boards, people sharing his exact experiences. He could have learned the word for his condition.
Instead, he was kept completely marooned on the island of his mother's reality. And this invites an analytical speculation about the mother's true, subconscious motives for withholding the device.
You think it wasn't really about building a work ethic?
If a parent's psychological equilibrium depends on the child remaining dependent, introducing a device that grants the child infinite access to outside resources, alternative viewpoints, and independent support networks is a massive threat to that equilibrium.
Wow, yeah.
The earn-your-own-money logic provides a socially unimpeachable cover story for what effectively operates as an information embargo. It keeps the system closed.
He is trapped by his sensory overload, he is trapped by a nervous system trained to shut down, and he is trapped offline by an information embargo. But despite all of this gravitational pull keeping him down, he actually tries to break out.
He really does.
He attempts to interface with the world. And this leads us to the grocery store incident, which is perhaps the most heartbreaking collision of his OS with the real world.
This is where we see the theoretical mismatch become a practical reality.
The source material details how the friend actually attempts to get a job stocking shelves at a local supermarket. Because he has no smartphone and no internet, his methodology is entirely analog. He sees a physical paper flyer. He uses his house's landline phone to call the store.
Operating entirely outside the modern digital infrastructure.
He manages to get an interview, and he actually goes. But he is rejected. And the reason the store gives for the rejection is that he was earnest, but too slow.
That phrase, earnest but too slow, perfectly encapsulates the tragedy of his interface with society. The author notes that this friend exhibits overlapping traits of ASD, autism spectrum disorder, and ADHD. We should map how these traits function as an operating system in this specific environment.
Let's do that, because otherwise we're just throwing around clinical acronyms.
The ASD traits construct his sensory reality. He requires a highly predictable environment to manage his thin sensory filter, and his processing of complex, unspoken social cues is methodical and slow.
Okay.
The ADHD traits add another layer. His working memory and executive function can become easily overwhelmed by multiple simultaneous demands, leading to a system freeze or spacing out, coupled with the profound need for the occasional impulsive release, which we saw when the alcohol lowered his firewall.
So we take this deeply complex, highly sensitive operating system, and we drop it into aisle 4 of a supermarket.
And we encounter a fatal software incompatibility. The supermarket is built on the standard societal OS. It operates like a high-frequency trading server. The singular metric for success is standardized efficiency.
Yeah.
How many boxes can you open, empty, and break down per minute? It requires rapid, thoughtless, repetitive physical motion.
But the friend's OS is not built for thoughtless repetition.
Not at all. His OS is a high-fidelity rendering engine. For him, the concept of doing something fast in a physical space equates to doing it sloppily,
Yeah.
which is abhorrent to his system. Because his sensory world is so rich and detailed, he honors the physical reality of every movement.
I can picture him picking up a single can of soup. He's feeling the weight of the metal, he's registering the texture of the paper label, he is carefully calculating the exact geometric alignment required to place it perfectly on the shelf.
It requires his full, undivided, earnest cognitive attention. To rush that process would be to violate the fundamental way his brain interacts with physical matter. His earnestness is profound. But the capitalist infrastructure of the supermarket does not value profound physical interaction with a can of soup. It values speed.
It's like trying to run advanced, deeply intricate architectural rendering software on a machine built strictly for processing millions of simple text emails.
Yes, exactly.
Neither machine is inherently broken. The architectural software is brilliant at what it does, but if you demand it process a million text emails a second, it will freeze. They are just fundamentally incompatible environments.
This brings us to a critical reevaluation of how society judges capacity. The source material forces us to confront and redefine the word severity.
And this is so important because if a listener tunes in and hears a summary of this guy, he can't hold a minimum wage job, his mom checks his pockets at age 25, he takes 3 hours to bathe, he just stares at a wall. The immediate knee-jerk societal diagnosis is, this is a severe clinical case. This man is an empty shell, totally disconnected from reality.
Which is a catastrophic misreading of his internal state. In clinical diagnostics, a truly severe lack of capacity often involves a profound inability to conceptualize the self or others, or a total absence of an internal emotional landscape.
But everything we've unpacked proves the exact opposite is true for him.
Precisely. His inner world is incredibly rich. He possesses a deeply complex sensory vocabulary, translating emotions into colors and textures. He harbors a desperate desire for connection, evidenced by his joy at karaoke when the firewall drops.
Yeah.
He possesses the drive and the immense courage to look at a paper flyer, pick up a landline, and walk into a supermarket to try and participate in a world that constantly rejects him.
He wants to be part of the network. The data is all there.
The capacity is fully intact. The tragedy is not an empty system. The tragedy is an input-output bottleneck. The bridge that connects his brilliant, high-resolution internal server to the external societal network has been structurally choked off.
Choked off by the sensory noise of the environment, short-circuited by the enmeshed parenting that dismantled his autonomy, and completely incompatible with a society that refuses to build a port that accepts his kind of data.
Not empty, just trapped. It is a profound paradigm shift in how we view the marginalized.
It completely changes how you look at the quiet guy in the corner. You stop seeing an absence of life and start seeing a life that is pinned down under immense atmospheric pressure. But we can't end this deep dive without turning the lens around.
Right.
We have spent all this time analyzing the friend, his family, and his OS. We have to look at the other side of the equation. We need to look at the person who wrote this material. What is the psychological toll on the childhood friend who is watching all of this unfold? What is the physics of being the helper?
The burden of being the designated outside world for a tracked system is immense.
Yeah.
It is a reality fraught with guilt, and it is rarely discussed with the analytical honesty it deserves.
The author is incredibly vulnerable in these notes. They reflect back on their youth, and they confess to actively scolding this friend, saying things like, "Why are you always so slow? Speak up. Get it together." You can practically feel the retrospective guilt radiating off the page. The author clearly feels terrible for having yelled at someone who is secretly struggling with all this invisible weight. But I read that and I wondered, was the scolding actually a bad thing? Or counterintuitively, was the anger a profound sign of respect?
It is a deeply complex interpersonal dynamic. If we strip away the surface-level harshness of the scolding, what is the underlying premise of the author's frustration? You do not get angry at an entity you believe is entirely devoid of capacity.
Right. You wouldn't yell at a broken toaster, you just throw it away. If you had completely written the person off as a lost cause, you wouldn't feel anger, you'd feel pity or total indifference.
The frustration is generated by a core belief in the friend's latent potential. The scolding, while perhaps blunt and unhelpful to his sensory overload, was a demand for equality. The author was essentially saying, I recognize that there is a capable human being in there, and I am demanding that you join me in the shared reality.
It was a refusal to treat him like a permanent invalid. But the reality of their relationship was incredibly lopsided. The author was carrying an impossible structural weight. For years, the author wasn't just a buddy to hang out with.
No.
The text outlines how the author was essentially this friend's sole piece of functional infrastructure. The author provided the smartphone and the Wi-Fi hotspot so the friend could access the internet. The author curated YouTube videos to try and stimulate a reaction. The author orchestrated the karaoke trips to provide a safe environment for the mask to drop.
The author was functioning as his external processor, his emotional regulator, and his sole gateway to the broader network of humanity.
And eventually, the physics of that relationship hit a breaking point. The author's own parent intervenes. The parent pulls the author aside and delivers a blunt warning. You need to stop hanging out with this guy. He brings a bad atmosphere.
Yeah.
When I first read that, my modern empathetic sensibilities flared up. I thought, what an incredibly judgmental, prejudiced thing to say.
It sounds entirely devoid of compassion. But if we analyze it through the lens of interpersonal physics and developmental psychology, the parent's intervention was not rooted in mere prejudice. The parent was accurately detecting the immense gravitational pull of the dynamic.
You used the word gravity earlier, like a black hole.
When one system is structurally collapsing due to neurodivergent burnout, profound isolation, and enmeshed parenting, it generates a massive vacuum. Continually trying to pump energy into that vacuum, attempting to animate a system that cannot sustain its own operations, requires a catastrophic transfer of energy from the helper.
And the helper only has a finite battery.
The parent recognized that the life energy the author was pouring into the friendly, the hours spent trying to pull him into the light, the emotional labor of managing his sensory needs, was energy that was being siphoned away from the author's own developmental trajectory. The young adult needs that energy to build their own career, their own primary relationships, their own foundation.
It's the classic airplane oxygen mask metaphor. You can't set yourself on fire to keep someone else warm.
The parent was diagnosing a structural reality. A weekly trip to a karaoke bar cannot overwrite 20 years of architectural damage caused by a toxic family system and a hostile society.
Yeah.
The parent was issuing a severe protective warning. His needs are bottomless, not out of malice, but out of structural damage. If you remain his sole anchor, you will not save him. You will simply be pulled down into the dark alongside him.
And that leads to an incredibly difficult but essential lesson on boundaries. I think anyone listening right now needs to hear this because we've all been in proximity to a relationship governed by guilt. It might not be this extreme, but we all know the feeling of being tied to a dynamic where stepping away feels like committing a moral crime.
Guilt is very frequently misplaced responsibility. In our culture, we tend to romanticize the idea of the relentless savior, but stepping away from a relationship that requires you to act as permanent structural infrastructure for another adult is not abandonment.
It's so hard to internalize that, though, because it feels like abandonment.
It feels that way because you are grieving the potential of the relationship. But we must reframe the concept of a boundary. Establishing a boundary is an act of acknowledging reality. It is recognizing the finite limits of your own psychological and emotional capacity. You can look back at a deeply draining relationship and hold two seemingly contradictory truths in your mind at the exact same time.
What are the two truths?
Truth one, the moments of connection were profoundly real. The laughter shared over a YouTube video, the vulnerability of hearing him describe his buzzy, colorful sensory world, the shared humanity in that karaoke room. Those were real, valid, and beautiful data points.
And truth two.
Truth two, you did enough, and you cannot fix his fundamental architecture.
You can honor the absolute reality of the connection in the past without sacrificing the reality of your own future.
Precisely. Acknowledging that someone requires systemic, professional, and structural intervention that vastly exceeds your capacity as a friend is the most honest and ultimately the healthiest conclusion for both individuals.
Man, that is a heavy but incredibly necessary place to land. Let's pull all of these complex threads together and look at the whole tapestry we've woven today. We started with the simple mystery of a quiet childhood friend sitting in a chair doing seemingly nothing.
And we discovered that his stillness is actually an intense, desperate calculation, a defense mechanism employed by a high-fidelity sensory operating system trying to avoid a catastrophic crash in a noisy world.
We analyzed the tragedy of an enmeshed family system where a parent's version of caretaking operates as a velvet cage, systematically starving a child's autonomy engine to maintain their own purpose.
We saw how modern societal expectations, disguised as tough love, like withholding a smartphone, can completely sever a marginalized person's only digital lifelines, ensuring their total isolation.
We watched an earnest, profound attempt to interface with the modern economy in a grocery store aisle get rejected simply because his operating system wasn't optimized for standardized speed. And finally, we explored the physics of empathy and the exhausting, necessary boundaries required when you are the only bridge connecting someone to the outside world.
It is a sweeping, detailed case study in how invisible architectures, neurological, psychological, familial, and societal, can invisibly trap a human being right in front of our eyes.
It really is. And it leaves me with one final lingering thought that I want to pass on to you listening to this deep dive right now.
Sure.
We live in a global society that is absolutely unyieldingly obsessed with speed. We demand efficiency. We worship freshness, instant communication. We want the package delivered tomorrow. We want the data processed immediately.
Right?
But in our relentless rush to build a world entirely optimized for the standard operating system, we have to pause and ask ourselves a terrifying question. How much profound, deeply earnest, high-resolution human experience are we completely erasing simply because it takes a little longer to render? Mm-hmm.
The next time you see someone sitting quietly in a room, moving slowly, doing seemingly nothing, before you apply the standard societal label, ask yourself, are they empty? Or are they simply overwhelmed by a vivid, incredibly dense, intensely colorful world that you don't even have the capacity to see? Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We'll see you next time.